those the last of the pizza rolls?
Yeah, that's the last of them.
Those are mine.
They don't have your name on them.
I will never forgive you for this.
Yeah, alright, whatever.
75 years later.
Greg, I'm so sorry. Can you ever forgive me for stealing those pizza rolls all those years ago?
No.
So today we're talking about family. Shocker, I know. But we're just about to finish this Atypical series, and today we're talking about arguably one of the most important aspects, at least in my opinion, of family, and we're going to be talking about forgiveness. There's a lot of reasons why you might need to forgive a family member or ask for forgiveness of a family member, especially your siblings. If you've got any brothers or sisters, you know what I'm talking about. But there's some situations where forgiveness is easier to offer than others. So take just a minute and do this fun little would you rather game. Would you rather forgive a family member for eating your candy or for eating your pizza? Would you rather forgive a family member for hurting you on purpose or on accident? And finally, would you rather forgive a family member for lying to you or lying about you to somebody else? We've all needed to forgive or be forgiven by a family member, right? Because as we've been talking about this whole series, no family is perfect because families are just made of people and people are never perfect. And in every family, people hurt each other, but when typical families hurt each other, they tend to respond with bitterness, with anger, or with revenge. But atypical families, on the other hand, while they do hurt each other, they instead of pursuing revenge, pursue forgiveness. And we've been saying that there is no family that God can't use, that your family can be used to do some atypical things in the world. But how? So far in this series, we've met the family of Adam and Eve, the family of their descendant Abraham, and the family of Abraham's grandsons, Jacob and Esau. But today, I want to introduce you to yet another generation of this same family, and that's Jacob's son, Joseph, and his brothers. We've talked about Joseph before. I want to encourage you to go read with your family Genesis chapter 37, verse 1 through 10. But let me just throw this little clip in and kind of catch some of you guys up on the story of Joseph.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all the others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat. And his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command there.
And so later on, the whole Middle East falls into this food shortage. And Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt looking for food. And then when they get there, who should they find as the ruler of the whole land?
It's Joseph, that guy they sold into slavery. But he actually saves them from starving to death.
And so here you have it. These are the great-grandchildren of Abraham who have done this heinous act to their brother, but God has transformed their evil into something good.
And that's exactly what Joseph says here in the last paragraph of the entire book. He says, you guys planned all of this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save people's lives.
Now, these words, they conclude the book because they actually summarize the message of the whole story so far. Humans keep choosing evil, and we are thinking they're screwing up God's plan, but he keeps turning their evil back into good. And somehow, he's going to use this family to restore humanity back to the garden.
So let's think for a minute about some family dynamics. Joseph is his father's favorite, clearly, and he isn't even quiet about it. Joseph decides, for whatever reason, that it's a good idea to tell his brothers that someday they will all serve him. We read that in Genesis chapter 37, verse 5. Check it out with me. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to mine." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So for obvious reasons, his brothers didn't like him. And what did they decide to do? They decide to sell him into slavery. Now, I'm not defending what Joseph's brothers did to him, but let's be clear, Joseph wasn't totally innocent. He was arrogant and he was a little obnoxious. Being an older brother myself, sometimes the younger brother, they just... Colton, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. One day, Joseph's brothers are working hard in the field, and Joseph heads out to meet them wearing his fancy coat that his father gave him, because of course he had to rub it in their face just a little bit more. And imagine you and your siblings are outside sweating in the sun while you're hard at work. Your brother, or in my family's case, your sister, your dad's favorite, comes strutting over to you wearing his fanciest, most expensive clothes, and you're covered in sweat and dirt and grime, and clearly your sibling did not come to lend you a helping hand or to give you a glass of water. Joseph's brothers are so tired of Joseph, his attitude, his favorite status, his dreams about how he would someday be their ruler, and in anger and jealousy, they throw him in a well, they stage his death, and they sell him into slavery, as you do. Now, I've needed to forgive my family before for some tough stuff, but I've never needed to forgive anyone for something like this. Joseph may have had an attitude problem, but this kind of retaliation from his brothers was just next level cruelty. If you watch that little recap that I put in just a few minutes ago, you already know how this story ends. Joseph saves the lives of his brothers, and he forgives them for what they did to him. Now, Joseph forgives his brothers, but when their father dies, the brothers get scared because they think that maybe Joseph is going to change his mind and try to get revenge after all. And they know that they don't deserve the forgiveness that Joseph has offered them. They don't deserve the kindness that Joseph has given them. And so they get scared. And in Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 15, we read this. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father has commanded before he died, say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke to them kindly. Joseph had every reason to be angry at his brothers. They sold him into slavery. But Joseph chose forgiveness instead of bitterness. Many years after Joseph forgave his brothers, Jesus preached a sermon to a group of his followers. And last week, we read part of that sermon about having tough conversation, but I want to continue reading in Matthew chapter 18, picking up in verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to him, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" And Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. And in some translations, it even says 7 times 70 or 7 times 7. The idea being that we are meant to forgive our family. Jesus goes on to tell a parable about a man who had been forgiven a huge debt, and it was a forgiveness that he didn't deserve. But when someone asked this same man who had been forgiven a huge debt to forgive them of their small debt, he refused. And here was Jesus' point. God has forgiven you, has forgiven me, has forgiven the world of so much. So give of that forgiveness to each other. It's the kind of forgiveness that Joseph showed to his brothers, and it isn't typical. It's hard to understand, and yet that's the kind of forgiveness that God has shown to us through his son Jesus. Throughout this series, we've been saying that if you want God to use your family to do some atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something atypical. That's exactly what Joseph did, and it's exactly what Jesus is telling us to do. Listen, when we've been hurt by someone in our family, the typical response is to get bitter, to take revenge, and to just let hate build up in your heart. But Joseph chose to do the atypical thing. He showed his brothers forgiveness, he showed his brothers kindness, and he showed his brothers compassion. Why? Because not so typical families forgive each other. In just a second, I'm going to share some actions and let you guys brainstorm some actions on how we can make steps towards forgiveness. But first, I want to acknowledge that this conversation might be a little confusing to some of you guys watching. That some of you might have a family member who has hurt you so deeply, so repeatedly, that the idea of forgiving them like Joseph forgave his brothers seems impossible. Now, let me be clear. If anyone in your family or not in your family has hurt you or continues to hurt you physically, emotionally, or sexually, this conversation is not for you. Listen, if that's you and that's where you're at, where someone has or is continually hurting or abusing you, God is not just telling you to move on, to be nice to them, or to protect them from the consequences of their actions. Listen, we can pursue forgiveness while simultaneously pursuing justice. But for the vast majority of you, that's not where you're at. But if that is where you're at, here's what I want you to do. Tell a trusted adult today. But like I said, the vast majority of you, that's not where we're at. In just a minute, I'm going to give you some time to talk with your family about how it is that we can take steps towards forgiveness. But just like forgiveness changed Joseph and his family for the better, being eager to forgive can change you and can change your family for the better too. So take a moment and talk about this. How do you forgive a family member who's hurt you? It seems like we've made forgiveness so complicated, and it doesn't have to be. It can be very simple. Now listen, it can be simple, but not easy. And it can be as simple as this. It can be as simple as admitting that you've been hurt. It can be as simple as telling God that you need help to forgive that person who's wronged you. It can be asking God to heal parts of your heart that have been hurt. And it can be as simple as choosing to focus on moving forward rather than focusing on what's happened in the past. Now, like I said, it can be simple, but not always easy. And sometimes maybe you just need to forgive yourself and to ask for forgiveness if you need to for the part that you played in what has happened. So think right now about a family member, or it can extend beyond family, but think about someone who you need to forgive. Imagine how if you and your family could be transformed if you were just willing to choose forgiveness over bitterness or over revenge or over hate. So talk about this. How do you think that forgiveness could change your attitude or your perspective? How do you think forgiveness could change the person you're fighting with? And finally, how do you think forgiveness could change your family's pattern of behavior in the long term? Listen, forgiveness is tough, but isn't it amazing that we get to forgive others the same way God has forgiven us? So here's the challenge for this week. What I want you to do is I want you to identify someone in your family, or it could be anyone, that you need to forgive. And I want to challenge you to write that name down. And secondly, I want you to think about why it is that you want to forgive them. Is it because you're tired of feeling angry? Because you don't want to be bitter? Because maybe you miss having a close relationship with that person? Write that down underneath their name. And I want to challenge you for this next week to pray for that person and to actively seek out forgiving them for whatever wrong they committed against you. Forgiveness is something that we can offer to those who hurt us, but it's also a gift that we give ourselves. Unforgiveness, or not being able to forgive, leaves us feeling bitter, it leaves us feeling angry and closed off to others. But when we let God help us forgive, we can find healing, we can find hope, and we can find freedom. We've talked about a lot of difficult things in these past few weeks, and that's because family can be pretty difficult, because families aren't perfect. We're made up of people, people aren't perfect, and so of course our families are going to have problems. But our imperfect families, thank God, aren't hopeless, because just like Adam and Eve, not so typical families can be used by God. Just like we learned with Abraham and Lot, not so typical families pray for each other. Like we learned with Jacob and Esau, not so typical families have tough conversations. And just like we learned today with Joseph and his brothers, not so typical families forgive each other. Listen, it's not your job to fix your family, but if you want to see your family be used by God to do some atypical things in the world, you have a role to play. Pray for your families, have tough conversations with them, and forgive them. And when it comes to your family, don't be typical.